Continuing Chapter 6. Each culture has its own thoughts about disease. In some cultures, sickness or disease is thought to be punishment from the gods. In others, being sick is something like permission to take a break, a legitimate reason to take a day off. Some cultures believe that sickness is a disturbance of energies. Chinese medicine, probably the oldest surviving system of healing in the world, is based on observations that our bodies are interrelating fields that can and often need to be adjusted or stimulated in order that we may be whole again. Herbs, diets, and acupuncture, and exercises like Tai Chi, in the Chinese way of thinking, all help balance, adjust, or stimulate the many energies in and around our bodies. In the West, we believe that illness is the result of an assault, an attack from outside the body, usually by microorganisms. This means patients are victims, and medical scientists are forced to think in terms of which organism caused which disease. The question, of course, determines the answer, and sooner or later we will always find new organisms that cause a new disease. But we miss much important information because we do not ask questions that are regularly asked in other cultures, such as why one particular patient acquires a disease that is transmitted through the air while another breathing the same air does not. Nor have we asked until recently how we might strengthen someone's immune system, perhaps the most common question non-Western healers ask themselves. Malays believe that the cause of any sickness is disharmony. The particular form the disease takes may be the result of an invasion of some microorganism, but why this person becomes ill while the next person does not is a consequence of the kind and degree of disharmony in the patient's internal and external environment. Malays and others have known about the immune system all along, although they do not call it that. Healing for Malays is, above all, about restoring harmony. In a very real sense, all of the Malay culture is focused on maintaining harmony among people and between people and their environment. Malay culture teaches the great value of not rocking the boat, of making gentle movements and not offending or even embarrassing others, of walking carefully and speaking softly. Where there is disharmony, it is often the healer who helps to restore harmony, although to facilitate this, as the Boma explained to me, the healer may give patients an herb to help them cope with a symptom. Ultimately, however, the effort of both healer and patient must be to restore the balance of the patient's environment, both physical and social. The Aborigines in Malaysia, I learned, think of an illness in yet another way. To them, sickness is a signal, a warning. Hey, you're doing something wrong. Stop and change. Healing for them means first find out what is wrong so that it can be changed or righted. The wrong may not be a behavior. It may be a thought, a feeling, or even a word. It is easier to change a behavior than it is to take back a thought, but it must be done to get well. Healing for the Aborigines is almost wholly in the hands of the sick person. If you are ill, you alone can heal yourself. No one can do it for you. What an outsider can do is find out what is wrong, diagnose the illness, and perhaps open the way for healing energy to enter the patient. As I came to know the Aborigines better, I found that there were people who assisted the process of finding out what is behind the illness and making what we would call a diagnosis. The same people would also open the way or pass healing strength to the sufferer. I talked with a few of these Aboriginal healers who sometimes call themselves Boma, but that was for my sake, I am sure. They knew I was studying Malay Bomas. Their role in the process of healing was different from the role of a Malay Boma. In terms of what they did, they seemed more like counselors, perhaps. We tend to think that assisting another in healing must be a profession because we think in terms of experts and professionals. The Aborigines do not. They have no experts, and in most simple societies, there are no professionals. The names they gave me for what they did or were doing varied. The names they had for themselves did not indicate what they did, but only suggested who they were. I call them healers. That is not what they called themselves. The Aborigines were consistently and deliberately simple people. What a healer did was simple. He or she talked with the person who hurt. These talks were not supplications, not requests for healing. They may have been addressed to spirits or to unseen forces, but ultimately they were discussions with the energies around the sickness. It was possible for a healer to do this work when the patient was not present. A hollow bamboo tube was then used, closed on one side so that it could hold water, sometimes decorated with traditional designs. Water was poured into the bamboo container, and a coin or something that had been close to the person with the pain was placed in the water. The bamboo tube then stood in for the patient. After the healer had determined what was wrong, healing energy was passed to the water, to the coin, which then gave it to the water. When the patient drank the water, he was able to heal himself. I asked whether the sufferer would learn what was wrong from the water. I was assured that yes, the message which tells what is wrong would pass to the sufferer. The water healing was colorful and seemed ethnic, but I had the impression that, in fact, it was far more common for the sufferer and the healer to perform the healing ritual together. One Aborigine healing session I attended went like this. First, the healer asked the atai of the sick person to make clear to the patient what she should do to remove the stiffness in her shoulder, which was considerably swollen, bruised, and seemingly immobile. Atai, or hati, with a silent H, literally means liver, but is used also to mean heart or emotions. In context here, it was obviously used for what we would call soul. Then the healer went through a whole list of possibilities. Maybe the woman was angry at that arm. Being angry or aggressive is taboo, the worst emotion a Signoi can express. Or maybe she had just worked too hard digging roots. Perhaps someone bumped against that shoulder when she was carrying something on her head, and to keep what she was carrying from falling down, she moved her shoulder in the wrong way. While the healer was going down the list, he rubbed the woman's shoulder, lightly at first, and then a little more firmly. I was watching the woman's expression. She was obviously in pain, but as the healer, in a sing-song, droning voice, continued listing the possibilities, he suggested, "Maybe you fell down and you broke your fall with your arm." Before he could finish his sentence, the woman opened her eyes and looked up surprised, as if to say, "Yes, of course, that was it." The healer continued to rub her shoulder, but now he was kneading to soften the tissue, as he explained to me in an aside, so that the healing can know where to enter her shoulder. The woman remembered. "Yes, I fell down on the way to the water. I slipped and fell on that shoulder." She turned her head and pointed with her chin to the hurt shoulder. I was carrying a child and did not want the child to be hurt, so the shoulder sort of buckled under me. And as she said this, she let out a scream as if reliving the fall. She began to turn her lower arm inward, elbow out, while holding onto an immobilized hand with the other healthy one. The healer, at the same time, put more pressure on the back of the shoulder until something moved. Again, the woman screamed, but this time more softly than before. She tried to move the arm, but it remained immobile. Then she smiled and said, "I still cannot move it, but I know that tomorrow I will be fine. I feel the healing working." The next day, the shoulder was less swollen, and she could move her arm a little. Patient and healer had worked together to effect a return to normal. Yet the patient clearly felt that she had done the actual healing, that the role of the healer had been to show her what had brought about the trauma and to pass along healing energy. On another occasion, I asked a healer whether sickness can sometimes be caused by spirits, by bad energies from outside. A doctor had told me once, with considerable irritation in his voice, that Aborigines considered tuberculosis a sickness of spirits. At that time, tuberculosis had become a serious health problem. It occurred to me that spirits as a cause are much the same as invading microorganisms, in this case, tuberculi bacilli. The healer looked at me, thought for a minute, and then said, "Sickness is inside, but sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves." "And then what happens?" I asked. He paused and then said, "The coughing sickness is not our sickness. We never had the coughing sickness before. Maybe soldiers brought it, or your people did." Then he frowned. He was right. Tuberculosis is one of the diseases that accompany the spread of civilization. It is we, the civilized, who bring diseases like tuberculosis, syphilis, smallpox, and even the common cold, along with other bacterial and viral diseases to people who live in isolation and did not have an opportunity to acquire immunities. I pressed him. "Does that mean there's nothing you can do about the coughing sickness?" Again he thought. "That is right. There is nothing we can do. Maybe as we get used to it, we can be healthy again." He was silent for a long time. Then, as an afterthought, he said, "But I do not think so. I think we will die." He looked at me then with an expression that I can only describe as sly, when he added another word in Malay, "Naik." When he said that, very strange and out of context, literally, naik means climb, rise out of, or emerge. Perhaps he meant leave our bodies? He would not explain when I asked him what he meant. I thought he meant we are dying out, climbing out of the shadow world, as the Aborigines call the world we live in. Toward the end of my stay in Malaysia, a dedicated young English doctor created a health system designed for Aborigines. A hospital was established in the jungle on the outskirts of the capital, Kuala Lumpur, thought to be a familiar environment but also accessible by road. Aborigine settlements were given battery-operated radios to summon medical help when needed, and people were trained to use this equipment. Finally, helicopters stood by to transport patients. The hospital was not run like a Western hospital. Neither the patients nor the medical staff wore uniforms, and patients were admitted with their families, who could prepare customary food for the patients. The treatment was with Western drugs, which was the best way to treat sicknesses that they recognized as not theirs. In our world, we applaud medical intervention that saves a life. We spend endless resources to extend a lifespan of an individual for a day, a week, a year. We may think our resources are the rewards of our efforts, our productivity, but the Earth's closed ecosystem, when we use resources, trees, oil, ore, much faster than they can be replenished, we destroy. If we destroy life to save a life, our civilization is doomed to extinction, as plant and animal species are doomed when they disturb the fragile harmony of the whole. Aboriginal people of the world will be extinct as tigers will be someday. Tiger tissue may be frozen in the hope that future generations can recreate these animals. A few tigers may be kept alive in zoos, but only a Westerner could think that a tiger could exist apart from its own unique environment and still be a tiger. The belief that we can save a tiger by freezing some cells is the very belief that is destroying the tiger's habitat, the belief that we can separate. A habitat is more than an environment and something to be exploited. In fact, the tiger and the jungle are one. Each cannot exist without the other. Chapter 7, The People. They call themselves Signoi, the people, also spelled Sinoi, though Signoi, with its glottal stop, sounds more like they themselves pronounce it. Others have different names for them. Anthropologists and government people call them Aborigines. Some people call them Sakai, and others call them the little people. They are elusive and shy. The people of the country among whom they live call them Orang Aslai, the ancient ones, because they are thought to have lived on the Malay Peninsula from ancient times. I had heard of the Aborigines, of course, when we had moved to Malaysia. They were a mystery. Few people actually knew them, and they hardly ever came down from the mountains and the deep jungles where they lived. The government estimated there were no more than 30,000 of them left, and I was told that this was probably a grossly exaggerated number. Government people showed me on a map that illustrated where the 3 Aboriginal tribes were. It indicated fairly large areas right through the middle of the country. There were no roads anywhere near. I met the first few of these Aborigines when I visited the anthropologists who were studying their language. The Signoi village was large, just off the highway. It was quite different from those that I would visit later. This was a show place. There were perhaps 30 or more people living in the community, at least twice the normal population of an Aboriginal settlement. The Signoi, as is true of many Aborigines, do not have settled villages. They are semi-nomadic, moving every few years. The people in this particular village were used to having visitors. They had lost some of their shyness. We had dinner, a mixture of imported canned food and rice, not the usual fare, I would learn later, and I noticed that very few of the people were eating. The meal had been prepared for the 2 anthropologists and myself, it seemed. During and after the meal, the anthropologists talked animatedly with their informant, a bright older man with a wonderful twinkle in his eye. The little house in which the anthropologists lived was quite dark and crowded with people. The scientists' voices sounded loud in the small space. Sometimes I felt husband and wife were competing with each other to make points. I did not listen to what they were saying because it sounded very technical. Although I was not interested in the finer point of linguistics, later I wished I had learned some of the language when I had had the chance. The people of the village were soft-spoken, and, the strangest thing, there was usually a little pause before one of the people in the group would say something. I had an odd feeling that they consulted with each other and perhaps designated one person to speak for all of them. After dinner, The conversation became even more animated. The hut reverberated with talk. I looked around and noticed that altogether only 3 people spoke: the anthropologists and the informant. The village people seemed to have disappeared, or perhaps they were invisible against the dark walls of the little hut. One tiny village woman was cleaning up after the meal. She scuttled here and there, collecting plates and cooking pots and sweeping the mats on the floor. She was so silent and unobtrusive, however, that there were a few minutes before I realized what she was doing. She did not make a big show of her work. She made herself almost invisible. When she came close, I whispered to her. She hunkered down near me. With a cup in one hand and a soot-black pot of rice in the other, I asked if she lived in this house. She smiled a radiant smile and said, "Oh, I live in the house over there." She motioned with her head over her shoulder, pointing with her lips. "I always clean up. If I did not clean up for them, the house would be eaten by ants and other animals. But don't tell her. She thinks she is keeping house." When I first arrived, the anthropologist had mentioned how much work it is to live as the natives do because everything was so primitive. But the wife added it made her feel close to the women. I should have lost interest in the people. My first visit had been rather boring and frustrating. It had confirmed my perception of the anthropologists as people who argue fine points of Western scientific theory without learning much about the people they are studying. I had learned almost nothing about the Aborigines during that visit, and yet I was strangely drawn to them. A few days later, I met a school teacher whose mother was an Aborigine. He allowed that he did not usually advertise his connection with the Aborigines, but he sometimes acted as a sort of liaison. If I were interested, he could tell me some things about them. We talked about his mother's people, and very hesitantly he told me there was a real settlement. Most Aborigines live deep in the jungle, never close to a road. He gave me directions and told me to park the car at a little Chinese store about 100 miles from where we live. Ask at the store, he said, and they will tell you where to find the path that leads to the settlement. I asked a friend to accompany me. We found the store easily and asked about the path. It would be about an hour's work, they said, but simple to find. After walking perhaps an hour and a half, we knew we were approaching the village when we heard voices, laughter, and people singing. We were tired and hot from our trek through the jungle, but felt refreshed when we heard those joyful sounds. When we arrived, however, the village was totally deserted. Not a soul was to be seen, not a sound could be heard. 6 empty huts stood randomly about a clearing. Since the people moved around, these shelters were minimal structures, built high off the ground and accessed by a steep ladder. Signoi shelters are used only for sleeping. Life is lived outside in the open during daylight. Because we were tired, we decided to wait, thinking the people of the village would return soon. We talked softly. Neither of us wanted to break that reverberating silence. An hour passed, and then 2 hours. We waited the rest of the day. Shortly before sunset, we saw the face of an old man peeking around a hut. He came forward very shyly, and we looked at each other for a while. I said in Malay, hoping he would understand, "We came to visit. I have met other Orang Asli and wanted to learn more." I mentioned the teacher who had told us about this village. He motioned for us to sit down while he sat across from us. He smiled the sweetest smile, and very softly he made it known that since it was dark, it was too late for us to leave anyway, so we might as well stay the night. He welcomed us in a mixture of Signoi, a language which has a fascinating rhythm and many glottal stops, a few words of Malay, and signs. The man was not really old, I discovered, perhaps his early 40s, but he was very wrinkled. He was the perfect host, self-possessed, calm, dignified. When he stood up, he gave a hand sign, and suddenly, from all around us, a dozen or so people came out, including some children. By this time it was dark. Someone had made a little fire, and they cooked some rice, which I learned later is not their staple, but they had some at this settlement for special occasions. We had brought some cans of sardines. My teacher friend told me to bring food and that sardines would be especially appreciated. Someone put some vegetables on top of the rice. That was it for cooking. In the anthropologist village, someone had made a speech to us before dinner, apologizing about the poor fare for the poverty of the village, a common enough ceremony in that part of the world, and a ritual that usually precedes a meal with important visitors. Here, the old man simply motioned for us to sit around the little fire and eat. They ate rice and vegetables. We, the visitors, ate rice and sardines. I tried to make them understand that we had brought the sardines for them, not for us. It took quite a while for them to understand and accept that we did not bring the sardines because we did not trust the food that they would prepare for us. On subsequent visits to this and other villages, I did not bring sardines or other gifts of food, or if I did not offer them until after the first meal. We stayed most of the next day at the little village and had a wonderful time. The second day they all sang again, laughed, and made jokes. I felt honored to be so accepted, but then I had hopelessly fallen in love with them. They were the most unusual people I had ever known. They had no neuroses, no fears, except of strangers perhaps. They had an immense inner dignity. They were happy and content and did not want anything. At that first settlement, communicating in a mixture of words and gestures that people use when they do not know each other's language yet, we learned about who they were. I should also get to know others of the Signoi, they said, and then they told us how to walk to another settlement, not too far away. And when, later, we did go to that other village, someone there suggested yet another. We were passed along from one village to the next. The first settlement, however, I would return to many times, and the people there became special friends. I could not, however, spend all my time walking from one village to the next. I was working and wanted to spend time with my family, but there were weekends or days that I could make free. On one of my visits, I was accompanied by the teacher. We went to a far settlement that neither of us had been to before. It was quite a walk, at least 4 hours, and included much climbing. The settlement was located high in the mountains. Until then, there had always been someone who would be sitting by the side of the path as we arrived at a settlement. But when we approached this mountain village, no one was there to welcome us. And even when we got to the little settlement itself, it was remarkably quiet. No singing, joking, laughing. The few people who were around did not hide from us, though when we asked them what was going on, they told us that a small baby, only 2 days old, had died that morning. Everyone in the village was very sad, they said. My friend, the teacher, suggested we go to the home of the baby. I did not want to intrude on someone's grief, but he assured me it would be all right. When we came to the hut where the little baby had died, there were people standing outside who made room for us. In this settlement, the houses were built quite high. There was a steep, notched bamboo that one climbed to get to an open porch, maybe 2 feet wide and 4 feet long. As my head came above the door of the porch, there was a little gasp from the 4 people sitting there. Then the teacher climbed up behind me and said, "It is all right. He is one of us." And they made room. We sat around the tiny body lying on a little pillow. Nothing was said. It was obvious who the parents of the little baby were. They seemed no older than 16, perhaps. The mother sat in what was almost a fetal position, all closed in. Tears rolled down her face every now and then, and she made no effort to hide them or even wipe them away. The boy, the father, sat next to her. He looked at his dead girl child with an expression of such sadness that it wrenched my heart. Occasionally he would lean over and stroke his wife's hair or hold her hand. We were allowed to share their grief. It was a gentle grief, no loud sobbing or tearing out of hair, but obviously a deeply felt pain that would leave a scar on their memories. I tried to imagine what it would be like to have to return the gift of a first child a few days after her birth. Finally, perhaps an hour after we had sat down on the porch, a middle-aged man sat up straighter and asked whether someone had a box to bury the little body in. Someone handed up from the bamboo ladder what looked like a little shoebox made out of splint bamboo. A few people left the little porch, and others came up, and among them an older man and a woman, perhaps parents of the young mother. There was some talk I could not follow. The teacher softly interpreted for me. The baby had to be buried with something that had been close to her during her 2 days of life. The only thing that had been close to her was the pillow she was lying on, a square about 12 inches on a side, woven of very fine matting. Too bad to bury that new pillow, someone said. The pillow was new. It could be used again. In the end, someone suggested that actually it was not the pillow that had been close to the dead baby, but the little cloth that had covered the pillow. With a feeling almost of relief at the solution, the baby was laid in the box. It had no lid, and then someone picked up the cloth and put it on top of the grave. The middle-aged man, obviously a priest or shaman, carried the little box through the village. We followed in a ragtag procession behind him until we came to the edge of the village, where some teenage boys stood around a hole that they had dug. The shaman, carrying the box, waited until all of us, maybe a dozen people, had assembled around the little grave. Then he stepped into the hole, the box under one arm, and he talked to the little child. We are sad to say goodbye to you. You made such a long journey to come to us, 9 months in the dark, and then, when you come out, you have to leave so soon. Here, he reached into the dirt to scoop up a little soil. This is dirt. Dirt is what the world is made of. You have never tasted dirt, but that is what this world is. He gently put some dirt on the lips of the tiny body. Here, taste it. At least you will have had a little taste of this world before you go back again. Your mother is sad to see you go so soon. Your father is sad. We are all sad, but we know that you have to go. There was a pause, and then, we let you go. The shaman who had been stooped over the box straightened up. He looked at the 3 or 4 boys who had stood at the edge of the grave and addressed them. The tone of his voice changed. It became strong and loud. You boys, listen well to what I am saying. Remember this, because when I am gone, you have to carry on. Do you hear me? And are you listening? Pay attention, you who have to carry on. He put the box in the grave and covered it quickly with a little dirt. The boys shoveled more dirt in with their bare hands until the hole, a small hole for such a small body, was filled. The handkerchief-sized cloth that had been close to the baby was placed on top of the dirt. More dirt was put on the cloth, and then stones were put onto the little mound. We left. The people are ancient. They are pre-industrial, pre-agricultural. They are semi-nomadic and rarely plant crops. Instead, they harvest what they need from what grows wild in the jungle around them. When the little clearing they make for a settlement becomes too overgrown, and when the jungle in the vicinity no longer provides what they need, they move. Their ways have not changed much in a long time. They have a few of what we would call material goods. They do not need them, and they do not want things that they have to carry when they move. Those I knew seemed healthy, although they do not live long according to our standards. They die from diseases they never knew before, diseases for which they have no natural immunity. Those I knew kept themselves apart, although the world intruded. The jungle they felt themselves a part of was being clear-cut and planted in rubber trees and other cash crops. Every year, the jungle they lived in grew smaller. Once, when I walked with a young man from one village to another, we talked about their shrinking world. I asked him about the changes he had seen in his 23 years. At some point in the discussion, when the difficulties and problems he listed seemed overwhelming, I blurted out, "But what can be done?" He smiled that achingly sweet smile that I associate with the people. We, who are civilized, do not know such smiles anymore. And he said simply, "Oh, we are dying out." That is what I sensed, he said. Literally, what he said was, "We are dead," or perhaps "we died." We were speaking in very simple version of Malay, in which there are no clear tenses. Whether a speaker means past, present, or future is for the listener to determine from the context. I sensed that he meant we are dying out. Today I reflect on the peoples of the world who are extinct. I am saddened to think that humankind entered a new century, leaving behind cultures, creativity, and the wisdom and the smiles of the people we have so thoughtlessly exterminated. Whether we know it or not, we are their heirs, and we must not squander that heritage. We can't forget. It is we who have to carry on.